Good evening, everyone. We are continuing our final segment in First Samuel chapter 17. It's a rather lengthy chapter, and we should complete it this evening. We ended last week with verse 37 when David offered himself to fight on behalf of Israel and of course on behalf of Saul. And he described how fearless he was guarding the sheep, and he had taken the enemy down of the lion and the bear. And as he says, the Lord who delivered me from the hand of the lion and from the hand of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And we ended last week by Saul saying, Go, and may Jehovah be with you. Now, obviously, one of the questions that would come into our mind is we're beginning to see the prominence of David. He might still be this shepherd boy who is seen as insignificant and with disdain by his brothers. He will run back and forth from the palace of Saul to play his lyre or harp, and then run back to the wilderness to guard the sheep. And today he is now at the battlefront. And with the battlefront, he has volunteered himself to represent Israel to fight the Philistines. Now, one of the things that we may not be aware or not clearly aware is that the stake on the table is extremely high. If Israel were to lose this contest, then all of Israel will serve the Philistines and vice versa. And this is one of those methods where, interestingly, ancient China and ancient countries used to pit their champions, the best fighter within themselves, against the opponent's fighter as a one man win all kind of a competition. And in this case, an ancient warfare technique. I would like to draw our attention at this point in time to where we need to bear in mind one particular verse in First Samuel chapter 16, which is the one before in verse 13. And then we'll continue with First Samuel chapter 17. In First Samuel chapter 16, verse 13, as Samuel anoints David, then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed, smeared or literally poured over his head in the midst of his brothers, in the view of his brothers. All seven of them must be extremely shocked that it was David who was anointed and none of the brothers. And David, in their eyes, is someone who they actually view with disdain. But I want to point our attention to the next sentence. The Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. This idea, the Spirit of the Lord, as in a small letter spirit, or wind, or character. And understand that with David, as the wind of God came upon him, and notice it's upon him, not into him, right? Upon him, it infused in him a particular character, which we actually call spirit, right? If you look at a person who is very determined and he is all the way going to accomplish what he has set to do, you would say that he is very spirited. No? He is a person with full of spirit to conquer, to take on the challenge. And so it is a description of character. But this came from God and it came mightily. And basically, what we are going to see in chapter 17 is the character of David displays regal character. Now, regal character, or what we call kingly. What is a kingly character? Now, understand that everything we are reading here needs to be viewed from ancient uh, Israel, very oriental. And in their case, when we talk about a regal character, would be one who is willing to be bold, to take the front lead, to defend the nation. And that's what kings are for in the old days. Kings are not to sit in the palace and wait for somebody else to die in front. Kings in those days are ones who will lead the battle charge. And so, what I want to point out is that from here in verse 13, we begin to see in chapter 17 this regal character of David, the willingness and the fearlessness to defend the nation, the people of God, that God will entrust upon him one day. Reading from verse 38 as we continue today, please bear in mind the Spirit of God that came mightily upon David, the character that God had desired of one who befits a king, one who is fearless for the nation, one who knows God and is willing to sacrifice himself to protect God's people. As we move on in verse 38, David has volunteered and Saul has said, okay, do it. Then Saul clothed David with his garments, and this would be Saul's garments. Now, understand that Saul is telling David, this Goliath or Goliath of the Philistines, he has been a fighter since his young days. But David has just been fighting animals. But David was willing to do that because he made claim that the Lord, Jehovah, will be with him as he was with him in the wilderness to protect him from the hand of the lion and the bear. And so as Saul sends David out to the contest, he put his garments, which is the defense cloak. He put a bronze helmet, and this would be more of a copper helmet on his head. And he clothed him with his armor to defend his body. Verse 39, David girded a sword over his armor and tried to walk, for he has not tested them, because he must be standing upright as all these armory is put on his body. And David said to Saul, notice, he says, I cannot go with these. With what? The sword, the armor, the copper helmet, and the garments of Saul. He says, I have not tested them. Not that he has not walked in them. And so let's take a look at this word, tested. In verse 39, the idea here is that these were not proven, right? He had not proven them. He cannot go ahead into battle because these are things that he has no confidence in. And so the word is not tested or not proven. And so whatever is not proven, you would realize that you are going into a contest that you've never picked up and used before, and you are putting your life on the line. And so David took them off. And the word took them off is to turn aside, right? Turn aside from putting it off, from putting it on. And so if you turn it aside, you'll be taking it off. That's what it means. Verse 40. He took his stick in his hand. This stick, uh, it is a rod. It could be a staff. These are all similar words. It's something that he has like a shepherd. And this is important because these are proven, tested. What did he use it for? He used it to defend himself and his animals from the wild animals taking them. And so he chose. The word choose literally means to decide, and it has these connotations. He has to choose, um, he has to test, examine, and then select or decide. All of these are good words to explain. And so what did David do is to work with what he considers proven, tested, the stick that is in his hand. He has always walked with them. He has always depended on it, and he has always used it as a weapon as well. Next, he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook. So there must have been a little stream that is flowing. And notice it is smooth, right? It is smooth. That is the emphasis of this statement. 5 smooth stones. Now, these stones are natural stones from the stream. And then put them in the shepherd's bag, which is also proven and tested, which he had. It's with him. And this is his pouch. So what do we have? Shepherd's bag, and A, his pouch, B. Same thing, right? Same thing. Proven and tested, which he had in his hand. And his sling was in his hand. Now, understand, in the old days, slings are very important elements of war. Now, we may think that this is a kid's play or a child's play, but that is not the case. We always have the idea of slings, and this is one of them. And slings are always used to hurl. Right? I think if you talk of Judges 20 verse 16, right? Judges 20 verse 16. In Judges 20 verse 16, we said among all this people were 700 select men who were left-handed. And these were, how should you say, these were the children of these were the inhabitants. Let's see. Sorry. These were the children of Benjamin. In verse 15 of Judges 20, number 26,000 men who drew the sword. And verse 17, among this people, among the 26,000 men, were 700 select men who were left-handed. Everyone could sling a stone at a hair's breadth and not miss. And so sling was as important as the bow and arrow of those days because they were a weapon of war and to kill. And so let's not think of the sling as a child's play, but think of a sling as a warrior's weapon. And so what we have is in his hand the stick, the sling, proven and tested, his bag, keeping 5 smooth stones that could fly like a pellet through the air. That would be like a bullet. And he approached the Philistine. Notice this, the word approach here is to come near. Now, it is important for us to understand the picture here, all right? So we have the Philistine, and then we have David. And we have this narrative that said that David went to approach Goliath, right? Goliath. The, 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 the idea here is David is going to fight the Philistine and not the Philistine coming to fight David. Now, many people have given a lot of speculation why the Philistine was standing there waiting for David to come by. And it is important also for us to realize that David understands the battle very well in verse 40. And in verse 40, without saying very much, I would like to offer a suggestion for us to understand why he picked 5 smooth stones. There have been a lot of suggestion, and let me offer you mine. I'm saying now that David, in his regal character, one that befits to be king of Israel, is now taking the place of Saul, whom Saul is supposed to go out, because the one who goes out is the one who represents Israel to defend Israel and fight for Israel's cause, and nobody dares. Everybody was terrified of the Philistine except for David, because David sees himself as one who can fight because God is with him, because he had had the experiences in the wilderness. And so God is not new to him. These experiences is when God is with him, he can face any enemy. And hence God looks at him as a man after his own heart. And that is where we're going to see the entire development of this chapter. Now, let me take us a little detour to 2 Samuel chapter 21. 2 Samuel chapter 21. In 2 Samuel chapter 21, reading from verse 16, this is towards the later part of David's life. And then Ishvi Benoth, who was among the descendants of the Rapha, right? It's important for us to remember this word giant is the word Rapha. And this word is used for the Anakim, the Zamzumim, the Emim. These were the ones we read in the book of Numbers, say chapter 13, and then in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 2, where we read of the Edomites taking on the land of Seir, the Moabites taking on the land of the Emims, and then the Ammonites taking on the land of the Zamzumims. And these were all called Rapha. In fact, further up north at the Golan Heights, where they call Bashan, we have King Og, who himself is a Rapha, big. And so Ish the Benov, who was among the descendants of the giant. So there is a giant that they all know, somebody who is bigger, right? The weight of whose spear was 300 shekels of bronze or copper in weight, was girded with a new sword, and he intended to kill David. Now, this idea of 2 Samuel 21 and in verse 16 uh, helps us understand that it's a descendant, right? A descendant. This would be a young man of the Rapha, a young man of the Rapha. I will use the word Rapha if you want to use giant, and that's what we are reading it. And so we have one here called Ishvi Benov. And we read here that Avishai, the son of Zeruiah, helped him, David, struck the Philistine and killed him. Right? That is important. Next, verse 18. And now it came about after this that there was war against with the Philistines at Gov, and Sibbecai, the Hushatite, struck down Saph, who was among the descendants of the giant, right? Another one here called Saph, also a Philistine. They were all part and parcel of the same clan. Verse 19, there was war with the Philistines again at Gov, and Elhanan, the son of Yaareh or Gaim, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. There was another one with the same name, but from a different place. Goliath, right? Goliath, the Gittite. Finally, in verse 20, there was war at Gath again, where there was a man of great stature, tall, who had 6 fingers on each hand, and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number. And he had been born to the giant. Verse 20. And when he defied Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, struck him down. These were 4 born to the giant in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants, right? Born to the Rapha. And so what do we have? The 4th one here was a big man, right? 6 by 4, right? 6 fingers by 4, and he had 24 in number. So he is an odd one. So what am I trying to say is, in 2 Samuel chapter 21, it lists out 4 more Goliaths, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and they were eventually all killed. So we come back to 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 40, and chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, which tells us this, that David, as he went down, he picked 5 smooth stones because he saw Goliath and four others at the back. That is probably what David saw. 4 more heads bobbing at the back, just like Goliath himself. And so it is very important for us to realize that David fighting Goliath is not by chance. He is fighting by experience. And let us now understand that he picked 5 stones not because he was afraid that he would miss, but he was concerned that the other four might attack him in the event. And that's why he had 5 smooth stones, because there were 5 of them. Now, perhaps this may change how stories told to children may have to evolve into a bit more color in this case. So let us now move on to verse 41. Verse 41, the Philistines came on. Now, verse 41 tells us that the word came on literally means walked, right? He walked, and he walked forward, and he also came near to David and approached, came near to David with the shield bearer in front of him. So let's draw this picture. We have David, and then we have Goliath, right? Goliath. And we have now, as we're told, another chap in front, an armor bearer, right? An armor bearer. In front. And so this is how it moves. And the bearer, office bearer, is one who actually stands between David and Goliath. When the Philistine looked, the idea of look is to pay attention. Pay attention. And as he paid attention, he saw David. He disdained him. This word here is despised, right? Despise. We have seen this word before, but this word despise literally means consider worthless. He thinks that David is not a worthy opponent, right? Not a worthy opponent. To Goliath, David was a youth, young to Goliath, not a seasoned fighter. That would be a better way of saying, not an experienced or seasoned warrior. And so Goliath actually felt, how would you say, he would have felt that the Israelites are trying to toy with him or play with him, and wasn't serious in entertaining this threat. That's basically how Goliath looked, and David is not a worthy opponent. He looks young to him, inexperienced, because he had no armor, no shield, no helmet. He was ruddy. He looks like a poster boy, very handsome in appearance. So why would anyone who looks well and good come out to fight? And that is why Goliath thinks that he is really not a worthy opponent. Verse 43, the Philistine said to David, "Am I a calf? Am I a dog?" What does that mean? Now, this really, he is offended, right? The Philistine is offended that Israel is not serious in this. Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And this word sticks with rods, that was in his hand, right? David had a rod in his hand. And he says, are you playing with me? You come to me and you bring little sticks or whatever you call them, and you try to play catch with me. What Goliath was wearing was a full battle armor. What David was wearing was his usual shepherd's clothes, with a pouch, with a sling, and with a stick, or you call it a staff or a rod. And that is why Goliath was so upset with Israel that he thinks that David is actually playing with him, as if Goliath was a pet. The Philistine cursed David by his gods. Now, the word curse here is very, how should you say, very strong word. This is a very strong word. And this word, how should I say, curse him is to make David look small, right? Make David look small in his gods. What does that mean? Goliath is trying to portray David as an unworthy opponent, one who is here to die, that he has no ability to fight, and that the gods of the Philistine will overpower David. And so now we have a situation that it is not just Goliath also by his gods. So they can see this, right? Goliath by his gods. Verse 44. The Philistine also said to David, okay, why don't you walk to me? This come to me is to walk to me. And I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky. The birds of the sky and the beasts of the field refer to the scavengers. Literally, to feed them. Because it is a foregone conclusion in the mind of Goliath that he will win this battle. I suppose he would think hands down, because he's looking at a totally inexperienced warrior before him. Now we go on to verse 45. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin. So you look at this. These are three pieces of weaponry. The sword, which is like the knife. The spear is actually a smaller staff. The javelin would be the long one. And David says, you come to me with sword, spear, and a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. And this, by the way, brings us, it's David in the name of Jehovah. And here would be Jehovah Tsevaot. And this is the difference. Now we have Goliath and his gods, and David by the name of Jehovah on behalf of Jehovah to teach Goliath and his gods a lesson. Because Goliath has taunted the armies of Israel. This would be the men whom are terrified of Goliath. And he says that you have taunted, you have tried to, how should we say, to blaspheme, to say things that is wrong, to defy God. Defying Israel is equivalent to defying God. And that's how David sees the scenario. It is not about Saul, it's not about the Israelites, but it is all about God. And so in this particular battle, David comes out as one who represents God in the battle. Not just Israel, the people of God, or Saul, the king of Israel. Verse 46. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. This day. This day is today. And it says, the Lord God, and this would be the God that he stands for. And it says that he will deliver you up. This word deliver you is to, well, I guess, deliver you up. You can think of it as shut him up, right? This word deliver is literally to shut him up and pass him over to David. This is how bold David is. Now, he knows God, obviously, because he is making a reference that God will shut up Goliath and place him into David's hands. And by doing that, I will strike you down and remove your head from you. This is another prediction that David says that he will do. He will strike you down, he will slay you, and he will remove. This word is turn aside. Remove his head. And then he says, I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth, all the land may know that there is a God, there is an Elohim in Israel. There is means what? There exists. There exists Elohim for Israel, not in Israel, for Israel, which means that God is for his people. And so he says that he will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines. What does that mean? It means that when this battle with Goliath ends, the battle with the army of the Philistines will begin, and they will die, and they will be fed to the scavengers, the beasts of the earth and the birds of the sky, so that there is a visual sign that tells us that God is for Israel, not in Israel. It's for Israel. The next part concludes, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Now let us break this down in its final form. And in this assembly, the gathering, this gathering may know that Jehovah does not deliver by sword or by spear. It merely says to know that all of these gathering, that there is that this particular engagement has no sword and no spear, right? This idea of deliver is implied. It does not exist in the Hebrew, right? This implied that all of them will know that the Lord is not, right? The Lord is not by sword or by spear. Then it says that for the battle belongs to God. It belongs to God. And He will give you into our hands of Israel. And notice, David represents, right? Represents Israel. It's not just himself, he represents the people of Israel. And so this is to show that this is a battle between the gods of Goliath and the God of David and Israel. And once the dust settles, then all will know, and it will be spread out far and wide that there is Elohim for Israel, that Israel is not alone. Israel has Elohim with them. Verse 48, then it happened when the Philistine rose and came and drew near to meet David, that David quickly ran toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. So when you look at verse 48, you find that we have Goliath and he was moving this direction, and we had David and he was moving this direction. It's very much of a one-to-one combat, right? One-to-one combat. And he ran towards the Philistine, and look at what he did. Verse 49, David put his hand into his bag, the shepherd's pouch, and took from it one stone, one, not a whole bunch, and slung and struck the Philistine on his forehead. So this is what we get as a story. He's got a sling, and there was a stone, and it hit him on the head, on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead. Now, the word sink is how you actually look at the picture. If this was your head, and this is the head of the Philistine, and the stone came up towards the forehead, it would have basically embedded in itself into the forehead, right? It would have embedded itself into the forehead. And this is the word sink. So it sink into his forehead so that he fell on his face to the ground. How is it that he can fall to the ground? Now, just look at the momentum. He's moving this direction, and he was stopped dead, right? Stopped dead in his tracks. And so the body was still moving, but Goliath would have died. And so what's happening is he would trip and fall, and bang, he was on the ground, head on, head on. It reads here, verse 50, thus David prevailed. The word prevail means he was mighty. This word is very interesting because this word was used in 1 Samuel chapter 16. Right? It was strong. Was how should we say that it was strong for David. He prevailed over over the Philistine. he was, how should we say, he was firm. Yeah, you can say that he was mighty, he was firm. He, I guess, prevailed, uh, came out strong. I think that would be a good word. He came out strong over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Not many more, but only one. And he struck the Philistine and killed him. And there was no sword in David's hand. And so understand that this idea, struck, was to kill. Right? He killed the Philistine uh, by striking at him, right? By striking at him and killed him. So all you can see is we have an A, here would be an A and a B. Struck the Philistine and killed him is actually one and the same. Struck him means that he used something to knock him and he died. And the second one is killed him means terminate him, terminated, put an end. And that would mean to kill. And there was no sword in the hand of David. And this is to show that God's word, right? God's word, that the battle belongs to the Lord, and it would not be a battle of sword, spear, and javelin. And so here it was a battle of the sling. Verse 51, then David ran, stood over the Philistine, took his sword. This would be Goliath's sword, right? Goliath's sword. Drew it out of its sheath and killed him. Now, how many times can you kill somebody? Verse 51, verse 51 is another way of describing cut off his head with it, right? Cut off his head with it. So this killed him is an A, or cause him to die, or put him to death, and cut off his head. Both says the same thing. Ended, terminated, killed, slayed, executed, and whatever words you can use to highlight this very important point that Goliath is over. The moment Goliath is down with his head off, the Philistines saw that their champion was dead. They fled. Because when he fell down, they didn't think that he would have died. Because remember, the narrative is always from the viewpoint of the observers, is by sight. Verse 52, the men of Israel and Judah arose, shouted, pursued as far as the valley to the gates of Ekron, which is the border of the Philistines. The slain Philistines lay along the way to Sha'araim, even to Gath and Ekron. We've seen these towns before in chapters 2 and 4. Verse 53, the sons of Israel returned from the chasing of the Philistines and plundered their camps, take everything away that they had brought. Verse 54, then David took the Philistines' head and brought it to Jerusalem, and he put his weapons in his tent. Now, hereby we have a forward reading, right? A forward reading. Now, how do I explain this forward reading? Now, in a forward reading, you find that Jerusalem is not a not a place, I guess you can say, not a place that they know at that point in time, because it wasn't called Jerusalem just yet, right? It wasn't called Jerusalem just yet. And so uh, we could see that this idea was written after David had taken over Jerusalem. That is an important aspect to know, how narratives were actually written, like in verse 54. So, verse 54, although it says that it was brought it to Jerusalem, it was to bring it to the Jebusite stronghold, or to the capital of Judah. Now, I would say that this would be referencing the capital of Judah, and not necessarily the town or the city called Jerusalem, because to take the Philistines' head, it would be back to the capital of Israel. And at the time it was written, it may have been described as Jerusalem, but at the time of its happening in verse 54, it wasn't called Jerusalem. Now, why is this so? Because you find this quite interestingly in the book of, say, Genesis, where you find the word Dan to Beersheba. No, Dan didn't appear until after Dan was born, much later, but it was used that way because the narrative was written after the time of the event. And so, as it was written down, whether by Samuel or by the other prophets together with Samuel, it was done at a later time in the writing of the narrative. Verse 55. Now, when Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, and he asked Abner, uh, Abner, whose son is this young man? And Abner said, by your life, O king, I do not know. So let's break this down. There's some very peculiar words here. It's not by your life, really. As the king lives, this would be a better way of expressing it, not by your life. I do not know. And so this is interesting. Saul saw David going out against the Philistine. And what did he see? He saw the Spirit of the Lord that was upon him mightily. This character of a regal person who can lead Israel is what Saul saw in David. Not that he doesn't know who David is, but he was shocked that this is the David who was playing the harp in his palace. And finally, the king said, please go and ask whose son is this chap. Verse 57. So when David returned from killing the Philistine, and this would be Goliath or Goliath, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the Philistine's head in his hand. So it wasn't so much that they went to Jerusalem, they went to the place where the king ruled, right? Like the capital. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I'm the son of your servant, Yishai, the Bethlehemite. And this is important because Saul is now beginning to see the reality of David. Whose son are you? Jesse, Yishai of Bethlehem. And here Saul saw the distinct kingly character of David. This is not the shepherd boy he knew. This is not the guy who played the harp when he was troubled, but he is someone else. And with this, we can say that Saul is now awoken from his slumber to know that there is somebody else who has that character that God desires to lead the nation. And with this, we've come to the end of chapter 17.